I welcome, dear students, I welcome you all to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Open University, Hyderabad. Today we are going to discuss about BA Sociology's topic, which is part of the second semester of first year. The title of the theme is Block 4, the title of the theme is Challenges for Social Transformation. As a part of that, we are going to talk about development, displacement and rehabilitation. So we are talking about the development, displacement and rehabilitation. It has larger implications for the making of the society and the way in which the people are organized over a period of time. So the basic idea about development is that almost all the human societies are known for undergoing the diverse phases of progress. So the basic idea of development is always equated with the notion of progress, the notion of positive changes and the idea of civilization and, broadly speaking, the overall human development of the particular nation or particular region. But how far this particular discourse is correct? Is it right to accept that development is for all or development is meant for few? That's where there are number of scholars in social sciences who are known for dealing with the very concept of development from diverse perspectives and from diverse themes. That's where we are going to discuss about what is the significance of displacement and what is how far the rehabilitation as a policy intervention are going to address the issues and challenges of the people who are victims of the development imposed displacement. So therefore, in today's topic, I am going to discuss about some of the broader themes and issues as a part of this particular unit titled Development, Displacement and Rehabilitation under unit number 13. Friends, as a part of sociology, the concept, so in sociology, the concept of development, displacement and rehabilitations are deeply interconnected and are studied through the lens of social justice, inequality, state policies and the lived experience of the affected people. So that means we are talking about the development. Development is not simply about the very idea of the very idea of economic development, but how far the development is understood from the perspective of social justice and what is the response of the state towards these policies. So this is where I wish to focus about some of the important themes related to the idea of development. So if you look at carefully, the development is primarily viewed from the perspective of economic growth by most of the economists. So until 1990s, most of the economists were known for highlighting the importance of growth from the perspective of GDP. So in fact, even some of the sociologists are also known for celebrating the idea of development. But so the critical scholars within sociology, they try to understand development from the perspective of equity, access and social well-being. I think that's where this meaning of development primarily varies from nation to nation, from one particular community to another particular community. It also varies from gender to one particular gender to another gender. So that means the idea of development is primarily determined by multiple variables. But let us see what are the sociological theories on the idea of development. So as most of you are aware that the modernization theory is one of the most popular theory which is known for advocating the idea of development from the perspective of traditional societies to the modern societies. I think that's where, dear friends, especially from the colonial period, from the 18th century onwards, most of the European nations which are developed already, they were known for advocating the idea of modernization theory, especially after the Cold War. That means from 1950s onwards, when America and Russia were competing for their hegemony over the nations, the modernization theory was primarily proposed and celebrated by the capitalist countries such as America and Britain. But the point is, how far this particular theory is relevant, whether the modernization theories are successful in different countries, I think that's where, my dear friends, one need to look at the critical theory which primarily emerged in response to the limitations of the modernization theory. So this is where some of these famous scholars by name Andrew Gunnal Frank and Immanuel Wallerstein, these are the scholars who are known for proposing a theory known as the dependency theory. So they try to argue that they try to argue that the developed nations are known for following the exploitative nature of development driven capitalist agenda. So therefore, the idea is that despite of even 75 years of independence to almost all the post-colonial countries, most of these countries even today, they are primarily their developmental agenda is primarily determined by the so-called developed nations, which are acting like imperialist nations even in the 21st century. So therefore, the scholars such as Andrew Gunnal Frank and Immanuel Wallerstein, they have developed a theory called dependency theory, where they have argued about the idea of the core and periphery relationship, where they came to a conclusion that even now most of the developing countries, they are placed at the bottom of the economic order. They are referred as the periphery, whereas the core nations are basically comes from the North America or the Western nation. So therefore, dear friends, we are talking about the development, how to understand development at the macro level as a part of the global economic systems theory. So this is where we can say that broadly there are two types of theories. The modernization theory, which advocates the idea of development. They believe that the development is for all, irrespective of any sociological markers such as class, race, gender and region. Whereas the developmental scholars, whereas the dependency school of thought primarily talks about the hegemonic relationship between the developed nations on the one hand and developing nations on the other hand. So therefore, the fundamental difference between the global north and the global south even now is reproduced even after 75 years of independence in almost all the African and Asian countries. So this is where, dear friends, yes, in social sciences in general and sociology in particular, some of the scholars, they have also developed one more theory known as the alternative developmental theory. So what do you mean by alternative development? Whatever the developmental policies which are followed by the mainstream nations, whereas the developing nations, how far they are relevant from the perspective of the sustainability and from the perspective of the indigenous communities. So if you look at carefully, the meaning of development primarily varies from particular one community to another community. So if you go to the indigenous communities who are popular known as the Adivasis in the context of Indian society, they were known for living with nature. Their basic idea is always about understanding nature from their culture primarily represent the nature. So they were known for having some kind of harmonious relationship with the nature. So therefore, my dear friends, these are the communities which are in a position to live for a longer time. They are in a position to use the resources in a very meaningful sense. These are the communities who are known for enjoying the naturality of the nature. So therefore, their quality of life based on certain indicators are far better. So the basic idea here is that the developmental model, one developmental model doesn't fit into all the different experiences. I think that's where the alternative model, which try to understand the idea of development from the perspective of the bottom of the society. So that's where, dear friends, one need to understand the basic idea of the development. So, but the point is that when you're talking about development, what is the outcome of development? Whether the development is working for all or other certain structural and functional limitations with reference to development. One of the major outcomes of development is displacement. So wherever you see the development, there is a large scale displacement. So that's where the classic example is all about the colonial rule. The colonial rule all over the world, which lasted for almost 200 years, known for displacing large number of the millions of people from one part of the society to another part of the society. As the students of social sciences, all of us read about the large scale migration in the name of the indentured labor during the British time. The people of Indian origin, they were forced to migrate to the African countries, Caribbean countries and other South Asian countries. So therefore, we find people of Indian origin from our neighboring countries like Sri Lanka to South Africa to, let's say, West Indies. So therefore, we are talking about development. What is the outcome of development? So the outcome of one of the major dysfunctions of development is displacement. So let us see how to understand displacement from a conceptual point of view, and what are the important reasons for the displacement. If you look at carefully, the displacement is primarily, let's say, primarily affects the vulnerable sections of the society. That means the marginal sections of the societies, from the perspective of underdeveloped nations, from the perspective of the socially backward sections of the society. So let us see what are the root causes of the displacement. So one of the major root causes of the displacement is large scale infrastructural projects such as dams, highways, airports and mining ventures. So though most of our prime ministers, most of the leaders, they were known for celebrating the big dams. As all of us are aware that Jawaharlal Nehru declared the big dams as the modern temples of India when he was, let's say, starting the Nagarjuna Sagar Dam way back to 1950s. But the point is, what is the meaning of dams for the tribal communities which are surrounded within the Nagarjuna Sagar Dam? But that's where the role of a sociologist, the role of a social scientist becomes very, very important. So what is the meaning of the highways? Though we celebrate the huge roads all over the country, all over the world, but at what cost the highways are developed? At what cost the airports are developed? At what cost the mining ventures were primarily started? So therefore, that's why, dear friends, we need to understand the fact that most of the Adivasi regions, or in a broader sense, most of the tribal regions, right, as well as and also the farmers. The farmers are the major victims of the displacement, the major projects. And also in the context of urban society also, one can find the different forms of displacement. How the displacement is primarily manifested in the urban spaces. If you go into the details, in the name of beautification of the city, in the name of expansion of the roads within the city, most of the people were forced to, let's say, relocate from their places. They were, as a part, in the name of beautification, the slums of the people of slum areas are, let's say, they are thrown away from the mainstream cities. So therefore, my dear friends, the meaning of development varies from the upper class to the working class. So therefore, we need to understand the development from a holistic perspective. And also one of the latest example, especially for the last 40 years in the post 1990s, in the context of liberalization, privatization and globalization, and all of us have witnessed the rise of the special economic zones. So wherein the private ventures are going with the special economic zones, which primarily demands large scale land capital. So therefore, my dear friends, even the farmers and the marginal tribal communities were forced to give up their lands in the name of the special economic zones. So what are the sociological consequences of the displacement? This is one of the important aspect of the displacement. Is it simply all about the economic aspect, or are there other important factors which also guides when they are displaced from one place to another place? One of the major outcome of the displacement from the perspective of sociology is loss of homes, lands and livelihoods. My dear friends, the idea of displacement, especially the forced displacement, it could be because of the political reasons, it could be because of the economic reasons, starting from the partition of India, where the millions of people were forced to migrate from one part of India to other part of India in 1947. Just you can imagine from 1947 to the ongoing major projects where the people were forced to, let's say, give up their homes, lands, and livelihoods. So, my dear friends, the human beings always carry the highest emotional bonding with their homes. The livelihood, the human beings, their nature of livelihoods are primarily driven by their places, the places of origin. But in the name of development, the people are losing their homes, lands, and livelihoods. And also, one of the another important outcome of this displacement is the breakdown of community networks. The human beings are not simply an individual. Man is a social animal, so they always wanted to live with the other. So, but unfortunately, the moment you talk about, let's say, the displacement, they are forced, their families are going to be fragmented, their community bonding is going to be fragmented. So, therefore, their idea of community, the community is going to lose its importance in the name of development. So, therefore, my dear friends, the people, when they were forced to migrate to urban areas, when they forced to migrate to some unknown areas, they always undergo a sense of alienation. They always undergo a sense of social alienation. That's where we need to understand that this displacement has larger sociological consequences. So, therefore, these people, the displaced communities, they undergo the cultural and psychological trauma. As I said, the displacement is not simply an economic experience. Displacement is not simply about losing their homes, but rather the displacement has a potential to produce the cultural and psychological trauma, because they feel that they are the lonely people, that they are lonely men in the larger crowd. So, therefore, there is no one to talk to them, there is no one to share their ideology, there is no one to share their food, because they feel a sense of alienation, cultural alienation, linguistic alienation, as well as they feel that they are not part of the other part of the spaces. So, therefore, my dear friends, the marginalization of the tribal communities, Dalits, and the rural poor can be seen whenever you talk about the displacement. So, therefore, who are the victims of the major dams? The victims of major dams are primarily comes from the subaltern sections of the society, who are popularly known as the farmers, popularly known as the Adivasis, Dalits, and rural poor, and most importantly, the women. So, now let us see with reference to, as I said, these are the landless agricultural laborers, farmers, and most importantly in the context of urban areas. Most of us, we discuss about the displacement from the perspective of rural India, but one should understand that displacement is also one of the major issue in the context of urban spaces. The slum dwellers are the major victims of the developmental projects of the cities. So, now let us see what is the response of the state and what is the response of the NGOs and civil society organizations in dealing with the question of the displacement. So, if you look at carefully, the government of India as well as the state governments, they always come up with the different policy interventions. The most accepted policy intervention as for the global norms, as a part of the UNDP discourse, is all about the rehabilitation. So, what is the meaning of rehabilitation and how it works? So, if you look at carefully, the rehabilitation refers to the process of resettling the displaced communities and restoring their livelihoods. So, my dear friends, you please remember that we are talking about rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is all about resettling the displaced community and restoring their livelihood. So, that means it is the responsibility of the government to show them an alternative spaces as well as to provide them alternative livelihood mechanisms. I think that's where the rehabilitation became one of the important policy intervention. Despite of all its limitations, the people from different parts of the world in general and India in particular, starting from 1951, they were known for accepting this rehabilitation as a kind of middle path, let's say, policy, which is going to work both in favor of state as well as in favor of the victims. So, let us see how the rehabilitation primarily works at the ground, how it primarily conceptualized within the policy discourses. One of the major idea of rehabilitation is economic intervention. As all of us know that the human beings always search for their livelihood. Livelihood is the primary source of the human living. So without livelihood, there is no meaning for life. So there is no dignity, there is no value for the human being. So therefore, dear friends, the government as a part of the rehabilitation policies is known for emphasizing on providing the land for land, that whenever there is a major let's say displacement because of the construction of a major dams, the tribal communities or the farming communities, they were supposed to be given the alternative land in other places so that they can cultivate. So therefore their sense of livelihood is primarily restored. So yeah, that is one particular, let's say, important policy mechanism. There is also another important dimension of this rehabilitation from the economic point of view is the compensation. So some of the governments, both the central government and state governments, are known for, let's say, giving some money as a part of the permanent solution for the displaced victims. So the money is primarily referred as a one-time solution. So therefore, by using that money, people can they start the new way of life. But according to the studies, sociological studies, anthropological studies, they primarily argue that the monetary compensation might work in the case of urban dwellers, but it primarily, and also in the context of rural India, it primarily works in favor of those people who are relatively educated, who have some social networks, who know how to let's say cultivate the land. But from the perspective of Adivasi community, the monetary compensation is not a viable solution. So that's how some of these studies are primarily reported. So another important mechanism, economic mechanism, is all about assuring them jobs. So whenever there is a major development project from the perspective of dams, from the perspective of industrial houses such as BHL and all, the local people were expected to be given jobs. So that's one of the reasons why the government of India, as a part of its Navaratna industrial houses, they were known for accommodating the local aspirations in the form of giving them at least the lower level jobs based on their qualifications. So this is how the economic issues should be assured as a part of the rehabilitation. But what is the sociological dimension of the rehabilitation? So according to the UN guidelines, rebuilding community ties and providing education and healthcare. So my dear friends, how to rebuild a community ties is one of the important policies. The idea is that when you are talking about displacement, the entire community should be relocated in a particular location. So therefore, the location gives them a chance to rebuild their community bonds. So therefore, even in urban India also, in cities like Hyderabad, but if you look at carefully, sociologically, if you try to understand, people of one particular region, people of one particular district, they try to settle in one particular part of the major cities. So these are one of the major sociological dimensions. That means the human beings always search for their human, let's say, passions. They always search for their culture. They always search for their, let's say, social bonding. So therefore, dear friends, it is the responsibility of the government to ensure the rebuilding of the community ties. And of course, as we are living in 21st century, one of the major sources of development and social mobility is the education. So without education, there is no scope for social mobility. So therefore, at least the government should ensure the quality education as well as the quality healthcare. So that's how the developmental scholars are known for in talking about the rehabilitation from the perspective of economy and social dimension. But what are the cultural dimensions? The moment you talk about cultural dimension, culture is one of the unique feature. Culture is the defining feature of a tribal communities who are popularly known as the indigenous communities. These indigenous communities were known for cultivating their indigenous practice. They are known for cultivating the traditional forms of farming. They were known for maintaining the traditional knowledge systems, and they were known for retaining the spirit of traditions. So therefore, the basic idea is that the government has to ensure their cultural bonding. So now the point is that, my dear friend, despite of all the, let's say, great policy guidelines, but what happens in the ground reality? So if you look at carefully, right, though the rehabilitation as a policy is good, but at the empirical level, it failed to ensure the proper monetary compensation in time, right? So they hardly bother to, let's say, give the money in time, and they fail to retain the spirit of the land, they fail to retain the spirit of cultural ties, and also one can say that the most of the rehabilitation policies, they suffer from lack of consultations with the affected communities, and because they feel that the bureaucrats and the state, they feel that they are superior to the common people, they know what is good and what is bad for them. But the point is that as the subaltern studies, as the modern studies categorically argues that we need to evolve policies based on the people intervention, not from the perspective of elite intervention. So as one of the major limitations of the rehabilitation is its gender blindness. So despite of the poverty, but the gender is one of the major dimension. The women were the major victims of the displacement, but we hardly find any special programs which are aimed to ensure the safety and security of women, which are aimed to ensure the livelihood patterns of women. So therefore, my dear friends, the women are the major victims of the displacement. So therefore, when you're talking about the idea of rehabilitation, we need to understand rehabilitation from the perspective of gender-friendly policies. So another major outcome or major limitations of the rehabilitation is the delays as well as the bureaucratic hurdles. As I said, despite of a number of good policy intervention, but when come to the question of implementation, it primarily suffers from lack of effective implementation of the policies because of the bureaucratic apathy, as because of the structural and functional limitations of the state as well as the bureaucracy. So therefore, we need to evolve the comprehensive policies for the development of the marginal communities who are the victims of the major, let's say, developmental projects, such as the Narmada Bachao Andolan is one of the classic example. For almost 50 years, this movement has been going on. So as the people, the common people who are victims of Sardar Sarovar Dam, even now they are fighting for their livelihoods, they are fighting for their customary rights as well as their constitutional rights. So therefore, my dear friends, we are talking about the idea of development. We need to think about development from the perspective of the constitutional policies as well as from the customary policies. And another important project is all about the Polavaram project. The people of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, they are very much familiar with the Polavaram project. But how far the people who are the common people, especially the tribal communities which are surrounded by the Polavaram project, how far they were given the compensatory mechanisms is one of the open-ended question which need to be pondered upon, which need to be understood from a holistic sense. So another major project which has attracted the attention of the scholar all over the world in general and India in particular is about the POSCO and Vedanta projects in the context of Odisha, where there was a large-scale protest against this kind of projects. So here also the major victims of the tribal communities. So therefore, the spirit of the point is that we are talking about this very idea of development. We need to understand the development from the perspective of displacement, and also we need to emphasize more about the importance of rehabilitation before we are going to, let's say, talk about the idea of development. So therefore, I feel that the development is very much important, but the development not at the human cost, but development with dignity. Development should be freedom. As Amartya Sen rightly highlights, we are talking about development. The development should be understood from the perspective of right to equality as well as right to equity. So that means the right to equality and right to equity is going to guarantee the right to dignity, because the movement of the idea of development is primarily initiated by the state, or initiated by the large-scale capitalist classes, which primarily undermines the importance of the dignity of the local communities and the livelihood patterns of the local communities. So therefore, dear friends, as Amartya Sen rightly uses the famous concept, the development should lead to the freedom. development should not lead to displacement. So therefore, today I wish to highlight that once again. We are talking about development, displacement and rehabilitation. So broadly, there are four schools of thought: the Marxist school of thought, the post-colonial school of thought, and the right-based approach in environmental sociology. These are the broader themes which are part of this development, displacement and rehabilitation discourse. So as a students of BA Sociology, all of you should be familiar with these broader discourses, so that we are going to have a holistic idea about the meaning of development. So thank you. I wish you all the best.